Imagine 2 feet of rain falling on your town in less than 2 days.
Not 2 feet over a week, not 2 feet over a season, 2 feet in 48 hours, while rescuers paddle canoes through flooded RV parks and break windows open with their bare hands to pull people out of rising water. That is exactly what just happened across the Gulf Coast of the United States, and the storm responsible has a name that sounds almost gentle, almost harmless. But there was nothing harmless about what Arthur did to Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi this past week. And what makes this story even stranger is that Arthur barely qualified as a hurricane season storm at all. It never even reached hurricane strength. It was, by every technical measure, weak. And yet it is now linked to multiple deaths, hundreds of flooded homes, tornadoes touching down across several states, and emergency declarations covering more than 100 counties. So how does a storm that forecasters openly called disorganized end up causing this much devastation? That is exactly what we are going to dig into, because the story of Arthur is really a story about how the most dangerous storms are not always the ones with the highest wind speeds. To understand how we got here, we have to rewind about a week and a half, back to the middle of June, when meteorologists were tracking a tropical wave drifting off the coast of Africa. On its own, that wave was nothing special. Tropical waves cross the Atlantic constantly during hurricane season, and most of them fizzle out without anyone outside the National Hurricane Center ever hearing about them. But this particular wave had bad timing. It collided with the leftover moisture from a separate storm, Tropical Storm Christina, which had already weakened in the eastern Pacific, but still had plenty of energy and water vapor left in its system. The combination of that tropical wave and Christina's remnants pushed into the Bay of Campeche around June 12th, and from there the disturbance crept generally westward across the Gulf of Mexico. It made landfall in northeastern Mexico on June 14th, where it began interacting with a stalled frontal boundary, essentially a traffic jam, in the atmosphere, where warm tropical air collides with a cooler weather front and just sits there, dumping rain instead of moving through. By June 16th, the system had drifted back over southern Texas, and the National Hurricane Center designated it Potential Tropical Cyclone 1. At that point, it still didn't have a well-defined center, which is meteorologists speak for we know something dangerous is happening here, but it isn't behaving like a normal storm yet. Sea surface temperatures off the Texas coast were sitting above 83 degrees Fahrenheit, which is more than warm enough to fuel tropical development, and within about 24 hours, the disturbance organized just enough to earn an official name. On June 17th, Tropical Storm Arthur was born, becoming the first named storm of the entire 2026 Atlantic hurricane season. Arthur made landfall almost immediately, coming ashore near Matagorda Bay on the Texas coast just hours after it was named, with maximum sustained winds around 45 miles per hour, only a few miles per hour above the threshold that separates a tropical storm from an ordinary rainstorm. The center of the storm tracked directly toward Houston, and the National Hurricane Center's forecast had it passing right over the city overnight. Governor Greg Abbott did not wait around to see how bad it would get. He issued a state of emergency covering 101 counties across Texas, activated round-the-clock operations for the state's Emergency Management Division, and ordered sandbag distributions in communities that were bracing for flash flooding. Houston, which was in the middle of hosting events tied to the 2026 FIFA World Cup, had to cancel several scheduled festivals because of the storm. Here is where Arthur started behaving in a way that genuinely worried meteorologists more than a stronger storm would have. Within about a day of forming, Arthur weakened below tropical storm strength and was downgraded to a post-tropical system, essentially losing its defined center and its officially tropical characteristics. Normally that would be considered good news. A weaker storm usually means less danger, but Arthur's problem was never really about wind, it was about water. Forecasters explained that because the system had become so disorganized and was moving so slowly, it was acting like what one meteorologist described as an atmospheric pump, continuously dragging moisture in from the Gulf of Mexico and wringing it out over the same patches of land for hour after hour after hour. The National Hurricane Center's director, Michael Brennan, told reporters directly that for communities hundreds of miles inland, rain, not wind, was going to be the storm's biggest threat. Early forecasts called for 5 to 10 inches of rain in the hardest-hit areas, with isolated spots possibly seeing 20 inches. As it turned out, even those alarming numbers undersold what was coming. While Houston dealt with flash flooding on Tuesday, including one especially terrifying scene out of the Woodlands, Texas, where a driver's car was swallowed by rising water on a road that had transformed into what looked like a swamp. The driver had to abandon the vehicle entirely and climb onto a small patch of higher ground surrounded by trees, waiting there until rescue crews could reach them. It is the kind of moment that emergency officials point to constantly when they repeat their now famous warning, "Turn around, don't drown," because so many flood deaths happen exactly this way, when someone underestimates how fast a flooded roadway can become a death trap. Around the same time, officials confirmed a death near San Antonio, where a woman's car was swept away by floodwater, becoming one of the first confirmed fatalities tied to the system before it had even officially earned its name. Once Arthur weakened and pushed further inland, the disaster didn't end, it just relocated. The remnants of the storm crossed into Louisiana and Mississippi on Thursday, and that is when some of the most extreme rainfall totals of the entire event were recorded. In rural Avoyelles Parish, Louisiana, meteorologists with the National Weather Service office in Lake Charles reported that more than 2 feet of rain fell in just 48 hours, with the majority of that total falling in a single day. The town of Cottonport recorded 29 inches of rain. Nearby Placerville recorded 22.5 inches. Simisport saw more than 17 inches. One meteorologist put it bluntly, saying that even by the standards of a region that is no stranger to heavy rain, this was catastrophic. At least 200 homes flooded in Avoyelles Parish alone, according to Louisiana State Representative Darrell Desautels, and the flooding was severe enough that Governor Jeff Landry declared a statewide emergency, citing widespread rainfall, ongoing severe storms, and flooding concerns stretching across the entire state. Down in New Orleans and the surrounding suburbs, residents watched canals overtop their banks as drainage systems struggled to keep pace with the relentless rain. In Kenner, a suburb just outside the city, intersections turned into rivers, and footage from the area showed streets completely submerged with only rooftops and stop signs poking above the waterline. One Houma resident, Connie Dubois, described living through plenty of hurricanes over the years, but said she had never experienced thunder and lightning quite like what hit her home that night, saying the storm was so constant and so intense that her house was lit up like daylight for nearly 20 minutes straight, and that for a moment she genuinely believed a tornado had touched down directly on top of her property. And that fear wasn't unreasonable, because tornadoes were very much part of this story too. The National Weather Service confirmed at least one tornado touchdown in Avoyelles Parish, with 3 more confirmed near the New Orleans area, all spinning up out of the same volatile atmosphere that Arthur's remnants were feeding. Further north, this same general weather pattern combined with a separate stronger line of storms to produce additional tornadoes and damaging winds across Illinois, Indiana, and northern Kentucky, tearing through homes, downing trees, and knocking out power across the Midwest in the same 48-hour window. In total, emergency officials tracked more than 257 separate flash flooding incidents across a wide corridor stretching from Texas all the way to Georgia. Mississippi was hit just as hard, and it's where the human cost of this storm became most painfully visible. In Pearl River County, officials evacuated roughly 30 homes near the Anchor Lake Dam after engineers determined the structure was approaching its water capacity, warning that any additional rainfall could cause it to breach. In Harrison County, crews carried out multiple water rescues, though officials didn't immediately specify how many people were pulled from rising floodwater. The most harrowing scenes came out of a campground near Perkinston, Mississippi, where life-threatening floodwaters trapped people inside RVs as the water rose around them. Rescuers had to use canoe paddles to physically break through RV windows just to reach people stranded inside, while cars and mobile homes elsewhere in the area were simply swept away by the current. A rain gauge near Perkinston recorded roughly 12 inches of rainfall in a single day. Mississippi's Governor Tate Reeves confirmed one of the storm's most tragic losses in a social media post Thursday night, announcing that a worker on a county road crew in the southwestern part of the state had been killed while helping with cleanup operations tied to the storm. His identity was not immediately released. Separately, state emergency officials in the region described a Mississippi resident who lost her home, her workshop, and her family's animals when a sudden catastrophic flash flood tore through her property with almost no warning at all. By Friday, officials were tallying the damage and the toll. According to reporting that tracked the storm closely, at least 3 deaths had been confirmed by that point, spread across Texas and Mississippi, and that number reflects only what had been officially confirmed at the time, meaning the full human cost of this event may still be coming into focus even now. Beyond the fatalities, flood risk alone was estimated to be threatening more than 63 million people across the affected region as the system continued grinding eastward through the southeast. So where does Arthur stand right now, as we're putting this together? The storm's center essentially fell apart days ago, weakening from a tropical storm into what meteorologists call a post-tropical cyclone, and then further still into a remnant low-pressure trough that no longer has the organized structure required to be tracked as a true tropical system. But its moisture didn't simply vanish. As of the most recent guidance from the National Hurricane Center, forecasters were watching the leftover energy from Arthur as it pushed out toward the eastern seaboard, giving it roughly a 10% chance of reorganizing into a brand new tropical storm. And here's a strange detail that a lot of people don't realize about how storm naming actually works. If Arthur's remnants did pull themselves back together into a new system, it would not become Arthur again. It would be given the next name on the season's list entirely, which in this case would make it Tropical Storm Bertha. So even though the original storm is gone, there's a real if small chance its energy reappears under a completely different name within the same week. Stepping back from the hour-by-hour details, what makes Arthur worth paying attention to isn't really its wind speed, which never came close to hurricane strength. And it isn't really its size, since by storm standards it was fairly compact and short-lived. What makes it worth paying attention to is the pattern it represents. A weak, disorganized, slow-moving tropical system that stalls out over land and essentially refuses to leave, acting less like a wind event and more like a sustained flood machine for days at a time. Meteorologists have increasingly flagged this exact kind of storm, the ones that don't make headlines for their category number, as some of the most dangerous because people tend to underestimate them. A storm that never reaches hurricane strength doesn't trigger the same level of public urgency that a major hurricane does, and yet Arthur is now responsible for multiple deaths. Hundreds of destroyed or flooded homes, several tornadoes, statewide emergency declarations in 2 states, and a flood threat that touched tens of millions of people, all without ever producing a single hurricane-force wind gust. And this is only the first named storm of the season. The 2026 Atlantic hurricane season technically runs all the way through the end of November, meaning Arthur is simply the opening chapter, not the conclusion. If a storm this disorganized, this short-lived, and this seemingly minor on paper could produce this level of destruction, it raises a genuinely important question heading into the months ahead, about how much we should be focused purely on wind speed and storm category when deciding how seriously to prepare, versus paying far closer attention to rainfall forecasts, ground saturation, and how slowly a system is expected to move. Because if there's one lesson sitting underneath everything that just happened across Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi, it's that the storms that crawl, stall, and linger can end up doing more damage than the ones that simply blow through fast. Arthur proved that in less than a week, and as the rest of hurricane season unfolds, it's a lesson worth keeping in mind for whatever name comes next.